All right, so let's get talking about the Norse, also known as the Nords or the Northmen, or also the Vikings. So these guys have a pretty spectacular reputation. I'm sure that you have heard of them quite a bit. When I say, the word Viking, what comes into your mind? Probably some sort of terrifying warrior, right? Filled with maybe a sort of battle frenzy, carrying an axe for battle, and being very utterly terrifying, maybe a bit wild with like a crazy beard. That's sort of the image that Vikings are most known for today. And it's not entirely inaccurate, but it's not 100% the full story either. So, who were the Norse? They were the people of the far north of Europe, hence a lot of their names. The area is Scandinavia, so areas like Sweden and Finland, that's where these people originated originally. And what's striking about them is that I think I mentioned this last time, they had a lot of culture in common with other Germanic peoples. For instance, their gods are very much connected to the old German gods. And we actually know the Norse gods a bit better because those stories were preserved, because they were written down later in a time period where people were more sympathetic to writing down the old pagan stories. Now, the Norse also had an influence, a surprising influence, in a lot of other parts of Europe outside of Scandinavia. They had an influence on Russia, and as we're going to see, they had influence on even places like Britain as well. So, where does the name Viking come from? Viking is basically just a word that means raiders or pirates, but maybe not pirates in our fun sense, more just like people who appear from the ocean and then like ransack you and burn down things and take all your stuff. That's sort of the image that people who use the term Vikings were trying to conjure up. Now, this is because we only really saw them, we only see them from the perspective of the people they conquered a lot of the time. The first writings that really referred to Vikings were monasteries along the coast of Europe that got raided for gold and jewels. So if you were one of these monks, it was pretty terrifying to meet one of these raiders. They would just basically take all of your stuff, as in Lindisfarne Monastery is one of the famous accounts of being raided by Vikings. And the Vikings were able to do this because they had really good ships. They had what are known as the longships, which were small but very efficient at just sort of maneuvering around the ocean very quickly and easily. So good on them. And with these ships, they would raid other people for loot. Eventually, they started settling in other parts of Europe, making their own towns and their own settlements. So that's sort of the perspective you might have if you were the enemy of the Viking. But this idea, a lot of people have this idea of Vikings as very uncultured, very sort of barbarian, right? Very sort of wild and rough and tough and stuff like that. Only if you were their enemies. Within their own culture, they seem to have been kind of nice in a lot of ways. For instance, I know a lot of people's sort of cultural touchstone for these Norse cultures might be the game Skyrim. In there, you have these sort of wild, sort of barbarian people, and a lot of them have very bigoted points of view. They don't like other cultures. That's not accurate for the historical Vikings. So you wouldn't want to get that confused, at least. The historical Vikings were actually very egalitarian towards other cultures and very egalitarian within their own culture. For instance, they had women warriors quite a lot of the time. I want to say like 1 in 3, but I'm not 100% sure about that statistic. But women seem to have been highly honored in that culture. Women could get divorced from their husbands, which makes a really big deal, and keep their stuff and own their own property, which also makes a really big deal for the quality of a woman's life in ancient times. Now, that said, there was still probably some male-dominated social norms, but not as bad as some other parts of the world. And in terms of interacting with other cultures, the Norse were actually very well connected with the Muslim world, weirdly enough. We think of those as so separate, but they actually traveled down into the Mediterranean, and they, sent their ships over to go trade with the caliphates, and, did pretty well for themselves. And seems to have gotten along and had really no negative views on Muslim culture, as far as we can tell. And it's possible that maybe even we definitely know some Muslim art made its way all the way, some gold and jewelry and things like that made its all the way to the north. It's possible that some people may have traveled that way as well. Yeah, but because the monasteries just remembered them as raiders who stole their stuff, they have this terrifying reputation. And to be fair, they wanted to intimidate people so they could get more stuff. Now, other stereotypes or views that we may have of the Vikings. Uh, what is the image that is in popular culture to the extent of sports teams and whatnot having it? It's the horned helmets, right? These helmets coming up from these horns coming up on the helmet. That is one of the pop culture inaccuracies that most people have about Vikings. Vikings did not actually have horned helmets. So a Viking helmet would look something like this over here on the right. It is a very sort of straightforward helmet. It looks cool with the kind of covering the face there, but no horns. Any thoughts on why? If you think about it, what's the disadvantage of having horns on your helmet? Somebody can just reach right up and pull you down when you're in the thick of battle, right? He can just pull you down to the ground. So that's a pretty bad idea. So don't go with that. Don't put horns on your helmet. The reason we have this idea is actually because of opera and Bugs Bunny in a lot of ways. So almost everybody has seen this Bugs Bunny cartoon. And before that, the opera that this cartoon is based of was by the composer and storyteller Wagner. Wagner had a real sort of thing where he would project a lot of his own ideas onto, and they weren't great ideas, onto the Norse and Germanic cultures. He wanted to retell some of the Norse and Germanic stories. But his costume designer came up with this idea of putting horns on the helmets of some of the warrior characters. And in people's minds, that became a image of the Norse cultures. And then over time, then Bugs Bunny came along and sort of cemented it in even more people's minds by showing this cartoon that a lot of people have seen, which is a great cartoon, don't get me wrong. But that's how we got the idea of Vikings wearing horned helmets, and they just did not. Other things that are not true about the Vikings, we mentioned they were sort of more egalitarian, open-minded to other cultures. Yeah, I think that's the main things. If you're thinking along the lines of comparisons to the game Skyrim, they did have burial mounds. They did have runes that were very important to them. Let's see, anything else? Trying to think. I think that's the main things. But the pop culture image of an ancient culture or medieval culture is very oftentimes missing some things. It may be half true, right? And so it's half true that they were terrifying to be your enemies, but the real truth is that they were very different if you were a member of their society. And that's kind of interesting. It might have actually even been nice to be a Viking. Now, the other thing about them is that they were very far traveling because of all that seafaring ability, right? And you guys probably know at this point, it's more well known, that Vikings, not Christopher Columbus, were actually the first to reach America. They made a small settlement there, and they named this new land that they found Vinland. But they didn't stay. They ultimately decided it wasn't worth it to stay over there. But some people think they may have, they caught a lot of fish and then sold them over in Europe. But they did conquer places like Iceland and Greenland, which were their new settlements and are still very influenced by that same Norse culture. But it wasn't just Iceland and Greenland. It was, in fact, quite a lot of Europe. So if we look at the pattern of settlement here, here is we start off with the red is where the Vikings were in the 700s, and then it goes century by century after that. Green is where they were raided, but they never actually settled down. So as you can see, they started off here and they got over to Russia pretty quickly. They got to Greenland and Iceland pretty quickly, and to England after that. Well, they actually did get to England and then continued to get further into England. So they built their own settlements over in England. And they built their own settlement right here on the coast of France, what we now call France. They even got over into Italy, although I think they were eventually kicked out of Italy. But yeah, they settled all over the place, and so were pretty influential. And what happens when Vikings settle down, when Norsemen settle down? Well, eventually they sort of start to become something different. A big place they settled down was this area along the French coast, which is known as Normandy. And in Normandy, they became known as Normans. So the Normans were, a few hundred years different from the Vikings. And so they had their own culture. But the Normans decided that they were going to go and conquer England. So that's exactly what they did. They just went across this gap here, which is probably the easiest way to get to England, and they conquered it. And this was William the Conqueror. He was how we now say the name of the Norman who conquered this region. And this happened in the year 1066. We know this because we have some pretty good records of it, including a very famous tapestry, the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, some people say this isn't technically a tapestry because it's sewn onto the cloth rather than embroidered all in one go, but or sewn all in one go. But let's not worry about that. The Bayeux Tapestry is really cool because it provides a record of this era. It's also just a fun, cool, quirky art style. And it shows the record of the battles of all these warriors coming in to take over England. And it shows some of the major warriors there. It shows some of the major figures. Here's Edward, and here is the king. So these are this would be the English people and the new king who was taking over the region. So we see some records of major battles and then major meetings and major events as preserved in the Bayeux Tapestry. Victory at the Battle of Hastings led to William the Conqueror's victory, and now these Normans had a settlement over this whole region. Here's Willem being labeled here. Now William the Conqueror is in the area, basically, is what the tapestry is saying. And so, yeah, it's very fun to see this art, and then this would be a way of sort of proclaiming your victory. So the Normans ruled over the people in England who were already there, who were known as Anglo-Saxons. And the Anglo-Saxons spoke a somewhat different language from the Normans. The Normans were speaking something more like Latin or French, something kind of in between. And the Anglo-Saxons were speaking something more like German. And the fusion of these two resulted in a language where you had both German types of words and Latin type of words. And this is basically still the case with English today. And in fact, the reason that Latin types of words have a sort of more refined quality to them is because those were the words that the conquerors used, the kings used, and then the peasants used the more earthy sort of words. So you could have, you could see if you were a peasant, but if you were a king, you would perceive, stuff like that. So I just think that's kind of interesting in terms of how language develops. But the Normans didn't just set out to change the language. They also want to rule. So what did they do when they got there? They built castles. So how do you build a castle? Basically, one way to do it is to build on a hill. Another thing you can do is to build on an artificial hill. You build up a big mound of earth. And actually, you can do both at once. So you can take a hill and you can build it even higher by building this big mound of earth, and then you build your castle on top of there. So you have the castle on top of the mound of earth, which is known as a motte, and then you build this courtyard where people can take shelter when enemies come. So if your city is being invaded by some enemy, you get all the people into the bailey. And protect them there. And if things go even worse than that, if the enemy breaks into the bailey, you can bring them into the castle as well. You can bring them all the way up to the motte. So that's sort of the layers of defense there. And you can see the remains here in this image of where there used to be a castle. But originally, the castles were not the famous castles that were built out of stone. We think William the Conqueror's first castles were actually built out of wood. That was easier. So it was more like a fort than anything else. But, you know, maybe a pretty big and substantial fort. But over time, like within the next 100 years, they were starting to build stone castles, and then they were building stone castles better and better with more advanced techniques. Um, yeah, so eventually we get to later castles where there is a stone keep, and the keep is kind of the key to securing your defenses. Because what do you want for defenses? You want to have something up on the hill that people can't break into. That's basically the idea of a castle. And if there was a knight or a king, they would likely live in one of these castles. And their quarters would actually be pretty small. In the early castles, their living space was basically the same as their sort of meeting their subjects space. And maybe like one bedroom area. So there wasn't much. The major thing of the castle was to have your soldiers in there and to be able to, you know, have very secure defenses. But this is also the time period where we start to see the knights in shining armor really developing. So originally, actually, even during William the Conqueror's time, we don't have the famous armor that you guys and me, myself, are most familiar with as images of the medieval period. The original armor is actually basically focused on chainmail. So you may have seen chainmail, and you may have heard that knights would put chainmail under other armor, but originally that was all the armor that people used. So chainmail is this sort of links of metal woven together to kind of try to create a bulletproof vest. You would also very often have a helmet with it. And if you look at the images from the Bayeux Tapestry, that's the kind of armor that these guys are wearing. They're wearing almost like, it looks like chainmail pajamas, but I think it's a little more than that. They're wearing chainmail pajamas and helmets, and they're using spears. That's what your armored knight might wear for a large portion of the Middle Ages, up until relatively late on. Then finally, almost at the very end of the Middle Ages, as technology got better and better, we see plate armor coming along. And this is the famous, I almost want to say, Dark Souls looking type of armor. This is the kind of armor with the flapped helmet and the sort of shielding on the shoulders with the pauldrons and whatnot. So this is the more famous kind of armor. But originally, this would have been the kind of armor that you would get. And sometimes you didn't even have this much armor. Sometimes you just had a shirt and a helmet. So that's interesting in its own right. Now, the knight would still be distinguished from the rest of his followers with having a horse. And that's a pretty big deal because it allows you to ride around and disrupt your enemy quite effectively. But this is sort of revealing that the Middle Ages wasn't one static thing. I think we have a tendency to think of it that way, but it really wasn't. It was something that where what people were doing was changing over time. And so I think we can identify different time periods in the Middle Ages. So that's what I want to take a look at now. So the 400s and the 600s, some scholars have called this late antiquity. This is the time period where Rome's power and authority is kind of dissolving. At the same time, the power and authority of the church, and we'll talk a lot more about the church on Monday, the power and authority of the church is rising, largely because people see that Rome is disintegrating, and a lot of the Roman people who are wealthy are donating their money to the church and saying, hey, you know, even if things are falling apart, at least I can be right with God, right? So the church grows in power during this time until it becomes a pretty powerful institution, arguably the only powerful institution to survive the fall of Rome. Then we have Charlemagne coming around 800 with his famous Christmas Day 800 crowning. Then 1066, William the Conqueror comes in and conquers England. Then in the 1100s and 1200s, we have more sophisticated armor and more sophisticated castles. So this is really where we have metal armor and stone castles. And then we have the full sort of kind of metal armor that is more famous, comes along around the time of the Renaissance. And that is the 1300s and the 1400s. So yeah, just to track how things are changing over time. Now this is still passing over centuries quite quickly, you know, going 1,000 years here. But hopefully that gives us a sense that things did change over time. Okay, so that's my little spiel on Normans and how they worked as knights. Um, what we learned from England, the way knights and castles worked in England, is pretty similar to the way it worked in the rest of Europe as well. I just wanted to focus in on that particular example. So in the next video, I want to talk about medieval literature and what its themes were and why, and then that'll pretty much wrap it up for today. So I'll see you in that video.